Amigos e meninas, eu sou o Teacher Gus.
Eu sou a Mary Hawks.
E hoje nós vamos falar aqui com o Garry Kitchen. Ele é o criador do jogo Keystone Kapers, muito famoso do Atari 2600, além de outras coisinhas mais. Nós vamos falar com ele agora. Olá, Mr. Kitchen.
Hey Gus, Garry Kitchen here, speaking to you from beautiful sunny California. As you can see, I'm sitting in my office and I'm glad to be answering your questions.
Olá, Mr. Kitchen. Vamos começar falando sobre o Keystone Kaper. Eu queria saber qual foi a motivação, a inspiração, porque aqui no Brasil a gente não teve muita informação sobre esse jogo, tanto que a gente não sabia nem qual era o nome dele. A gente sempre que pensava em jogá-lo, a gente falava, vamos jogar o jogo da polícia e ladrão. Pra mim, eram aqueles guardinhas da Guarda Real Britânica correndo atrás do ladrão dentro do shopping.
É por aí. E eu enxergava alguns objetos como sendo, às vezes, até um pedaço de kryptonita ou um dinheiro que ficava soltando raios.
Na verdade, era uma máquina de jukebox.
Uma máquina de jukebox, né? E aí? Qual que é a sua interpretação? O que você pode falar pra gente sobre o Keystone Kapers?
Keystone Kapers was about a Keystone cop chasing a crook through a department store. Now, the Keystone Cops were made famous in Hollywood movies in the 1920s and 30s as the bumbling detectives in slapstick comedies. I wanted to do a humorous game, so I used a Keystone Cop chasing the crook in a department store because of the ability for me to add obstacles in the store. So the obstacles which you ask about are a shopping cart, a ball, and a flying model airplane from the toy department, and the mysterious one, which you haven't figured out, is a cathedral-style antique radio. Now, the reason there's an antique radio in a department store is my dad was an avid collector of antique radios and televisions. My house was full of them when we grew up. So, in honor to him, I put an antique radio sitting on the floor that you had to jump over. The waves coming out of the antique radio, which your players in Brazil may have interpreted as radioactive waves, were actually sound waves of music coming out of the radio. So that solves that mystery. Now, the items you were picking up were bags of gold or suitcases of money left behind by the crook. Reason I made the game kind of twofold. Number one, I wanted to do a fun, humorous game, and I thought Keystone Cops would be great for that. Number two, many times a game concept comes from a technical breakthrough that you have on the machine. I was playing around one day and I made a really fun-looking escalator that animated very smoothly with the steps coming down. It was very hard to do technically. I thought it was really cool, and I had to come up with a game around the escalator. So that's where the department store came. That's where the cop running, and then you could jump up on the escalator. That was all part of the technical breakthrough that I thought would be fun to put in a game. Interestingly, when I first started working on Keystone Kapers, it wasn't horizontal like Pitfall. It was vertical. You would climb the outside of the department store, screen to screen, chasing the crook who was climbing ahead of you. And he would be throwing things down like television sets or toys or antique radios. I had just begun to prototype that concept when David Crane came from the West Coast to visit me on the East Coast, where I was running the Eastern Design Center for Activision. And when I showed him the prototype, his reaction was that it may be too much like an arcade game named Crazy Climber. And he suggested that I make it more like this jungle runner game that he was working on called Pitfall, where you would run side to side through the department store. When he came up with that, I immediately thought of my escalator, where I hadn't found a home for it yet, and put the escalator in so I could do floor to floor. It was a very hard game to fit in a 4K cartridge. I think when I finished the prototype, it was 6K, and I had to get it down to 4K. One of the casualties of saving memory was I had a beautiful Model T antique car parked in front of the department store, and you ran by that and into the department store to start the game, but I couldn't fit it anymore. I had to take it out. It was a lot of memory. Hated to see the car go, but it was a 4K cartridge. Anyway, I really enjoyed making Keystone Kapers, and I'm glad you loved it. And, by the way, when I made Keystone Kapers, I had this little guy sitting on my desk, little Keystone Cop here, and I still have him on my desk today. So he was the inspiration for the look of the character.
Quais eram as dificuldades de programar para o Atari 2600 na época?
You know, as far as difficulties of programming the Atari 2600, it is a really difficult machine to program, but also great fun. David Crane and I used to joke all the time that it's more fun making a 2600 game than it is playing one, because we love the puzzle solving aspect of the machine. I'm sure you know this, but I'll reiterate. The machine was designed to play two games. Pong, which is two paddles and a ball bouncing between them, and Tank, or Combat, which was two little tiny tanks that could turn and fire bullets at each other. Therefore, all the hardware of the 2600 has is two sprites for the two tanks or the two paddles, and three projectiles, little tiny single-bit objects, and a very crude background, which you'd recognize from the Combat game. You have the very crude walls that you can drive around in. That's it. That's all it has. It has great color, 128 really nice, brilliant colors. Has terrible audio because, well, for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is the tones are not in tune to music. So it's very difficult to do music, and there's another story on that, which I'll tell you in a minute. And the processor is very slow. 1 megahertz was pretty slow for an 8-bit processor. And very limited ROM space, only 4,096 bytes. And it only had, probably the biggest problem, is it only had 128 bytes of RAM. Computers today have gigabytes of RAM. Even the first IBM PC had 64,000 bytes of RAM. And the Atari 2600 only had 128 bytes of RAM. That was it. That was probably the most difficult part. Now, as far as programming, putting objects on the screen, making things look beautiful with color and animation, you were severely limited because the processor had to run synchronous to the scan of the television screen. So every time the television would scan a line, the microprocessor was executing code synchronous with that scan. So if you tried to do too much on a scan line before the TV could get to the next scan line and you went past that limit, then the whole thing would blow up and the screen would look terrible. So that was really the trick, was writing very fast computer code that stayed within a limit of cycles you had to work with on a single scan line in the TV. Quite the headache, but once you got to know how to do it, it was tremendous fun trying to figure out how to manipulate the machine and write your code to stay within the constraints, but make it do beautiful things.
E como foi a inspiração para o Pressure Cooker? Porque se a gente for observar, ele é um jogo ele fez o padrão para jogos hoje em dia de gerenciamento de restaurantes, de fast foods. Como é que ele foi feito? Você pode falar um pouquinho algumas coisas do background dele?
You know, while I'm generally known more for Keystone Kapers and the home version of Donkey Kong, both on 2600, I really enjoyed doing Pressure Cooker because it was a completely original idea that had never been done before. The interesting story of Pressure Cooker was I don't have the finest food palate. I'm somewhat of a junk food junkie, even today. But back when I was working for Activision in the early 1980s, I absolutely was. So I will admit that at one point in time, I found myself standing in a Burger King. I'm not sure if you have Burger King in South America, but I was standing at a Burger King, waiting in line, and you could see from where I was standing that the burgers are, at least at the time, put on a conveyor belt, and the conveyor belt travels along over an open flame. And then they claim that the burgers are flame broiled. Well, I saw this conveyor belt and the burger going over it. And once again, just like the escalator, I was fascinated by seeing if I could make a conveyor belt with an object sliding over it. So I immediately went back to the office after lunch, made a conveyor belt, put a burger on it, made a flame, and said, there's got to be a game here. This is pretty cool. So I made Pressure Cooker. Tweaked it a lot to get it to play well. It came out kind of on the edge of the crash of the industry, so it didn't sell as many units as Keystone Kapers, but I really enjoyed it. Now, I mentioned before a story about sound, and that story is the song at the beginning of Pressure Cooker. It's a jingle, and I think it sounds pretty good. I really went out of my way to make it sound like real music. And it was very hard to do because on the Atari 2600 you had individual tones. D, 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 up a scale. As you can see, I have no musical ability. So those tones were not in tune. They were not designed to be the notes in a real musical scale. So people would write music for the 2600 and just use the ones they had. And I always wondered when I was playing 2600 games why most of the songs sounded like garbage. Because they weren't really using notes, they were using the closest they could get on the 2600, which was usually pretty bad. So I decided I wanted a great song at the beginning of Pressure Cooker. I wanted it to sound like a professional jingle, and I didn't want it to sound sour or out of tune. So I went through every note that was possible on the 2600, every tone. And when I found one that was perfect, that was exactly in tune, I had a Casio keyboard next to me, and I marked the key with a piece of tape, little black tape. And then I would go and find a bunch of sour ones, and then I'd find another good one, and I would mark that key with a black piece of tape. When I was done, I had a keyboard, and I had a bunch of keys that were marked in black. And I hired a professional jingle writer who came from New York City, and he wrote jingles for TV commercials and advertisers. And we sat him down in front of the keyboard, and we showed him the game, and we said, we want a game jingle. And he said, great, I can write one of those. Do it right now. And I said, but there's one limitation. You can only use the keys that are marked in black. And he looked at me and said, what? What are you saying? And I said, you can only use the keys that are marked in black. So write a song that only uses those keys. And he did. Took a little while, but he did. And I put that song in the game, and the music and Pressure Cooker sounded great. Really enjoyed that innovation. Thought it worked very, very well.
Eu acho que pouca gente sabe, mas você é o criador do Game Maker, que foi um aplicativo que em 1985 já possibilitava aos jogadores criarem os próprios jogos. Isso para o computador, né? Já que pouca gente conhece, você poderia então falar um pouquinho, dar uma iluminada sobre esse Game Maker?
I had originally done a product called the Designer's Pencil. So the Designer's Pencil was a product where you got to do rudimentary programming to control a pencil on the screen of the computer. So as you can see here, there's a little programming language down at the bottom that I created, a little simple language, and you got to move a pencil around the screen using computer code. Wasn't really a game, more of a computer toy. But it was really fun to write, and it was amazing, just in a few lines of simple code, the beautiful patterns you could create because of the mathematical progressions. I mean, imagine writing a little program. There was a command for a circle, obviously. So you would do circle, and it would draw a circle, and then you would add 1 to the radius of the circle, and it would draw another one, and you would get this beautiful spiral effect. So that was really fun. But whenever I went out anywhere and talked to people about pencil, what they would say to me is, yes, it's really cool. I love the programming part. Can I program a game? Can I write my own game? So I decided, after hearing this time and time again, to make Game Maker. The idea behind Game Maker was to allow people to use a similar simple programming language as I had done for Designer's Pencil, but be able to write an entire game. So to do this, I had to create an entire game environment, which involved creating a sprite making tool to make animation, a sound designing tool to create sound effects, a more robust programming language to give you the ability to write simple games with commands like if bullet, hit, ship, then explode. Simple things. As well as a music composing tool and a background drawing tool. You took all those pieces, put them together, and you could build your own game. The game could then be put onto a blank floppy disk and sold and distributed, so you had your own ability to make a game. It was critically acclaimed, and it did pretty well commercially, but I'll tell you honestly, my biggest regret in my career is that I didn't continue to evolve it and work on it. In hindsight, Game Maker was the type of product that I could have worked on for years, continued to put out new versions as computers got more powerful, and really have ended up with a groundbreaking tool for multimedia, for game making, for presentations, for animations. This was before a lot of tools like that hit the market, before things like Macromedia Director, if you're familiar with that. So I wish I continued to work on it. But in that age of the industry, people didn't do that. You built a game or a product, you put it out, you moved on to the next one. You didn't stay with it. You didn't continue to update it and make it better. And I wish we had done that for that product. In fact, to this day, when people find out I did Game Maker, they ask me, have you ever thought about rebooting it? Because it would still be very relevant today.
Como foi trabalhar com David Crane no jogo A Boy and His Blob? Você tem alguma história que você possa compartilhar com a gente?
So David Crane and I have known each other since 1982. I met him when I went to Activision from the East Coast in 1982 to interview for a job. As it turns out, I opened the East Coast Design Center soon after. But when I first went out, I walked into a conference room. There was David Crane and Alan Miller, and I was scared to death because these guys were legends. A funny story about that, I brought my brother Dan along, who's also a game designer. And he and I were in that meeting, and we were very intimidated because here were the gods who had done Fishing Derby and Dragster, and Ice Hockey had just come out from Alan Miller. And on the conference room table was an Atari 2600 with ice hockey in it. So after we spoke for a while, Dave and Al slid the 2600 over. Al reached and turned the power on. Ice hockey came up on a TV screen, and Al said, "Anyone want to play?" Well, I'm a decent game player, but Dan was the master game player. So he picked up the controller and proceeded to whoop Al Miller in his own game, beating him soundly in ice hockey. And that really earned us some respect with the Activision guys, and it broke the ice, and we ended up working with them, which was great. So Dave and I have collaborated the entire way through Activision, Absolute Entertainment, Skyworks, and even today we collaborate. We always did it from a distance. I was on the East Coast, Dave was on the West Coast, 3,000 miles apart. But recently, in the past few years, I moved to the West Coast, so we collaborate more often face-to-face now because we're about an hour drive from each other. For Boy and His Blob, it was great fun working with Dave. He had worked initially on the first world, which was the underground world, the large maze that you navigated through. But we both agreed that it needed a second world. So I went off and independently started working on Blobolonia with the gameplay involving the blaster. So I worked on that while Dave worked on the first level, and we were able to combine the code and put it together. We have an amazing ability to read each other's code, which is pretty rare because most programmers have a very hard time reading code from someone else, but Dave and I are able to do it, and that's really helpful. A good Boy and His Blob story. While I was working on Blobolonia, I was writing code to make an object bounce like this, back and forth. Pretty simple. But when I wrote it, it was a little round object, a little white round object. When I wrote it, I made a mistake. There was a bug in my code. So when I ran the code, it didn't take one object to move it back and forth. It took one, and then it seeded another, and then it seeded another, and it seeded hundreds of these objects. So they went back and forth, and they ended up looking like one character that was segmented, had a segmented body with dozens of little white overlapping elements that bounced back and forth, looked almost like a worm, completely by accident. And I took one look at it and said, well, this is really cool. We've got to put it in the game. So we ended up taking this worm character, which you see on Dave's level and my level, and put it in the game because it was really neat. So sometimes you come up with great stuff that you weren't even trying to do.
Dos jogos todos que você já fez, eu sei que é meio difícil dizer, mas você tem algum favorito seu?
This is a question I'm always asked. What is my favorite game that I worked on? And it's very hard to answer. I have to say the product I'm most proud of is probably Game Maker because of the depth of it, and most importantly, because of the fact that people in the industry have come to me and thanked me for it and said that playing with Game Maker when they were a kid inspired them to go into professional game design. I've had this happen numerous times when I'm at conferences or shows and I speak, people come over and say, I want to let you know that after playing with Game Maker, I decided to do it as a career. That is incredibly gratifying, and I am proud of the fact that I was able to inspire people to do it as a career.
Você joga hoje em dia? Que tipo de jogo que você gosta, assim? O que te prende mais a atenção quando se trata de jogos?
As far as me playing games now, do I play games? Yes. Now I'm busy, so I don't have the bandwidth of a 14-year-old where I can read a 100-page manual and take 30 hours to learn how to play a game. But I play smaller games. I play casual games. I play a lot of games on this guy. I'm sure everyone has one. And there are millions of games on here, 95% of which are complete garbage, but once in a while you'll find a good one. And I also do play a little Xbox One and PS4. I have teenage sons and a teenage daughter, and they all play. So I'll play with them sometimes. I've been known to play Ghost Warrior 3, which is a sniper game. I also play a little bit of Call of Duty and Medal of Honor. I really like the versions of those games that are historically accurate because I'm a big history fan. And I like playing a World War II scenario game because I appreciate the history of it.
Como que você considera a indústria de jogos hoje em dia? Você acha que, assim, comparada com os anos 80, na época do Atari, existe muita diferença? E ela é positiva, é negativa hoje em dia? Qual que é a sua opinião?
You know, as far as the business today goes, it's amazing the size of it. It's amazing, the games, the graphics, unbelievable. Now, I would say the graphics have gotten incredible, but the gameplay has not really improved dramatically. I mean, 3D is great, and walking through worlds and open world environments are all very amazing. But it's still a challenge to make a fun game. David Crane was speaking at a conference a couple of years ago with me, and one of the very well-known console designers who had done one of the $50 million open world combat games came over to Dave and told him that he decided once at the end of a project that just for a laugh, he would do a single screen game like a 2600 game. Not on 2600, but a game of that style. Single screen, fun gameplay. And he told Dave it was much harder to do that than it was to do one of his big mega projects. Because you're not leaning on all this heavy graphics and audio and video and sounds and orchestrated music. You have a single screen and you have to make an experience fun. And he was amazed how difficult that is to do. You know, as far as the industry today, I wish there was more innovation. It's really sad when you get one great Call of Duty game, and then before you know it, you have 20 ripoffs. Or you get an Angry Birds game, and then you have 20 ripoffs. You'd love to see more innovation. I actually would love to see more innovation. But with the budgets being 50 or 100 or $150 million, people are not motivated to take a risk. So you see a lot of great games coming out of the indie community where the games don't cost as much to make. But in general, I love the game industry. I still love it. I still fool around and make games periodically. But, you know, it's a great industry. I thank God every day that I get a chance to work in it.
E se você pudesse deixar uma mensagem para os desenvolvedores aqui do Brasil, qual seria?
You know, if you're out there in Brazil and you're thinking of being a game developer, the barrier to entry is actually pretty low these days. You can get a tool like Unity and download it for free. A lot of these great tools have a personal license, which doesn't cost anything. I would say go download a tool like Unity or Unreal Engine or Coco's 2D if you're thinking of doing an iPhone, and fool around with it. Play with it. It initially will be so enormously intimidating. When I first looked at the Unity screen, my head exploded. And I've been doing this a long time. But you just have to push through the pain for 3, 4, 5, 6 hours, whatever it takes, to get comfortable with what's on the screen and understanding what everything does. And little by little, you make progress. And you put an object on the screen and you make it animate, or you make it move, or you make an effect happen, or you play a sound, and before you know it, you're doing a little bit more and a little bit more. The internet gives you an unlimited resource to ask questions and add code that other people have written, or download things and look at how they're done or modify them. And if you have the drive, you can build a game. Even if it's a rudimentary game, even if it's a copy of another game, just build something. Always start by building something. And don't tell yourself you can't do it. If you put the effort in, you can do it. And at that point, once you've built something, Doesn't have to be great. It just has to be done. We had a saying when we were building games, the best game is a finished game. You want to work on it forever. You want to make it great. You want to add every feature imaginable. But at some point, you got to button it up and ship it. And that's the hard part, is finishing it. So fool around with something, come up with an idea, even if it's a simple idea, but build it and finish it. And then do another one. And then do another one. And at some point, you'll have a portfolio of these small games that you've built, and you can go to a major publisher or developer and say, look, I can actually do it. And the percentage of people that walk in for a job that can actually show them something is probably 1 out of 100. And you want to be that 1 out of 100. And if you can do that, you can work in the industry. So good luck.
Muito obrigado, então, Gary, por ter participado aqui da nossa entrevista, tá certo?
Obrigada pelas respostas.
Sim, espero que você, caso que esteja assistindo, tenha gostado também.
Thank you for listening to my crazy stories. Gus, thank you for your informed questions. And goodbye from sunny California.
Até a próxima, bye bye.